Welcome to the Quality Meat Scotland podcast. Industry updates and best practice to promote, support, develop and protect the Scottish red meat sector.
Hello, I'm Mark Stephen, and thanks very much for choosing to listen to this. Way back in 2006, a report was published by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization entitled Livestock's Long Shadow, which made a pretty striking claim. The report said that globally, livestock produce more than 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions. More greenhouse gases, in fact, than the world's transportation sector. That's all the buses, lorries, cars, motorbikes, ships, planes, you name it. Now, all animals, us included, produce methane. But can it really be true that livestock are more of a risk to the planet than cars? Dr. Karen Beauchemin is a federal scientist in Canada and is recognised as an international authority on greenhouse gas emissions from livestock farming. Karen and her colleagues have established a broad-based research programme to improve feed utilisation of beef and dairy cattle while reducing methane production. First off, Karen, thank you very much and thanks for giving us your time.
Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here, Mark. Thank you.
Do you know, I don't know if you know the specific report, but, that claim in the 2006 United Nations report, would you describe it as being accurate?
Well, when that original report came out, there was a lot of skepticism. And actually, that report had some very blatant errors and they went back and revised that report. So the revised numbers are actually 14.5% of the global emissions are attributed to livestock production, including ruminants. And that includes methane production, nitrous oxide associated with crops that are fed to the livestock, and importantly, land use change. So the methane from cattle is only about 3 to 5% of global emissions. So it's a part of that 14.5%.
But it is fair to say that cattle are contributing to the problem.
Cattle are certainly contributing to the problem, as is all of agriculture, producing feed for livestock, producing livestock for meat and milk for human consumption. We produce greenhouse gases in doing that, but we're producing food.
How do you go about measuring methane production from cattle?
So we have a research program that is designed to help producers reduce their carbon footprint or reduce their methane emissions. So in our research, the first thing is we have to measure methane. So we have a series of techniques that we use. And the technique we use depends on the goal of the experiment. So we might start at the laboratory scale, and we're measuring in the laboratory methane emissions coming from different types of feed. For example, we have a program right now where we're screening Canadian seaweeds to identify if there are any seaweeds that could be added to diets to reduce methane emissions. Then we scale up from there and we have whole animal chambers. So we place an animal in a room and we measure the methane coming into the room and the methane exiting the room. And we know the differences from what's produced by the animal. So that would be on a smaller scale. We get a diurnal or daily pattern in methane emissions. And then we scale up from there. We might do a production experiment where we want to measure feed intake and growth rate of the animal. So we have measurement systems that we use in pens of animals. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but the animal would approach a feeder in a pen, for example, and while the animal's head is in the feeder, we would get a measurement of methane. And so over a whole production cycle, we would get a measurement of methane for a particular animal on a particular diet over a period of time. And then finally, we worked with other colleagues who are experts at measuring methane at a large scale. So large groups of animals on pastures and in feedlots. And that type of measurement would be to get a single number, a methane emission from a group of animals fed a particular diet. So we might use that technique, say, on a farm scale. So the point being is there's no one technique. There's a series of techniques that range all the way from laboratory up to the farm scale. And so what technique we use really depends on the goal of that particular experiment.
When it comes to designing experiments, that must be a bit of a nightmare because you've got so many variables. You've got different breeds, different numbers, different environments, different feeds, you name it.
Exactly. So in our research, for example, we try to control all the variables that we can. So for example, if we're looking at a particular diet, for example, we've done work to look at the impact of feeding fat or lipids to cattle and what happens when you add oil seeds, for example, that are high in fat. So we would control, we do the experiment on a single breed. We'd start with animals that are all of the same genotype or the same genetic background. We would feed them a controlled diet, and then we'd feed that same controlled diet with our added oil seed of interest. So we would control all those factors and just compare the control group to the treatment group. And the difference then would be the impact of that particular diet that we're evaluating.
Have you found yet any sort of or any form of dietary supplement that actually reduces the methane?
Certainly, there are a number of dietary factors that reduce methane emissions. So, as I mentioned, feeding lipids or fat sources to cattle reduces methane emissions. So if you were to add oil seeds or crushed canola seed, crushed rapeseed, or flax seed to animals, for example, those animals would have lower emissions. However, that can be an expensive approach. So we've been looking at other ways. So for example, I should back up and say emissions are highest when the diets are higher in fiber. So by feeding concentrates and grains to cattle, we reduce emissions. But we don't want to overfeed concentrate to beef cattle because, of course, their unique niche is their ability to digest highly fibrous feeds and make use of that energy in producing beef. So we've looked at what is it about forages that produces methane. So we know there's differences depending on the type of forage. So, for example, a forage that has a lot of starch, like corn silage or cereal silage, barley silage, for example, or oat silage, that would result in less methane per kilogram of feed consumed by the animal than, say, grass silage. We also know that legumes, so legume silages produce less methane than grass silage. So, for example, feeding alfalfa silage would reduce methane compared to grass silage. So there are a number, and I should also mention improving forage quality. So just harvesting silages or hays that have lower fiber content, harvesting at an earlier stage of maturity certainly reduces methane emissions. So there's a whole array of technologies or diet related strategies that can be implemented to reduce methane emissions.
I'm trying to work out how that would fit into the Scottish pattern because I would say many, certainly probably the majority of Scottish sucklers are on pasture most of the year, and we've lots of animals that are on hill farms, quite poor quality land, but they manage to convert what they can find into good quality meat. But does that count as high fiber, low fiber? What is that?
Absolutely. I should mention that the same thing for our beef industry. Of course, we have a little thing called winter, which lasts for 6 months of the year. But during those summer grazing months, our beef cattle are not supplemented. Those cows are on pasture, grazing pasture. So there's a lot that can be done in terms of the pasture itself, the composition, the species of the pastures, and the grazing management. So anything that improves the quality of the feed, so keeping those pastures at an earlier stage of maturity, improving the diversity of the species in those pasture mixes would reduce methane emissions. So it's about improving the grazing management in a way that we get more beef from the pasture and reducing the methane emissions from that forage that's being consumed directly by the cattle.
I feel I need to apologise for this next question because it's probably quite clumsy. Do indoor cattle produce more methane than outdoor cattle?
It really comes down to the quality of the feed. Well, first of all, presuming that they have the same body weight and genetics and what have you. I mean, the same cattle outdoor versus indoor, there's no difference. The difference would be on the feed quality that they consume. So methane production in the rumen is a direct result of the amount of food. The more feed that's consumed, the more the methane. So a dairy cow, for example, produces a lot of methane because a dairy cow eats a lot of feed. And the quality. So it's the amount and the quality. So the more fibrous the feed, the more methane.
Okay. But basically, you're saying what you want, you don't want the grass to go long and leggy. You want to keep it reasonably short and fresh. And the more varied it is, the better.
Exactly. However, having said that, we do recognize that there is the unique niche of beef, the beef cattle industry, to be able to use very low quality feed. For example, our Canadian beef industry relies on crop byproducts, for example, straw, chaff, etc., as a winter feeding supplement. So there is room to continue to feed those byproducts to beef cattle. But when we are at pasture, for example, when there's an opportunity to have higher quality feed, then we need to maximize that quality to minimize emissions.
And going back to what you were saying about supplementing the diet with using fats or lipids, is it possible to overfeed those supplements? Is there a point beyond which it's kind of counterproductive?
Yes, it is. That's a very good point. With fat, we have to be careful because high levels of fat in the diet will reduce the animal's ability to degrade fiber in the rumen. So we don't want to do that. So when I talk about adding fat, I'm talking about adding 2 or 3% fat to the diet. So you have to make the calculation because oil seeds contain different levels of fat. So the total amount of fat in the diet of an animal fed forage is already about 2% fat. So we don't want to increase the total amount of fat beyond 5 or 6% of the diet. A little bit of supplementation is good. A lot of supplementation is bad.
Tell me about 3-NOP.
So 3-NOP is a feed additive that is manufactured by DSM Nutritional Products. That's a company out of Europe. And we have been working with DSM for a number of years now, looking at the potential of feeding 3-NOP to beef cattle and what the impacts are in terms of methane reduction and performance. So 3-NOP is a feed additive that inhibits methane production in the rumen. So we did a number of smaller scale studies in our research feedlot and in our research barns, and saw that when we fed 3-NOP to beef cattle, we had a reduction in methane of about 20-25% when animals were fed a high or completely forage-based diet, up to 80% reduction in a feedlot finishing high concentrate diet. So we also observed in our production experiments improved feed conversion efficiency. So based on those very exciting preliminary results, we then spent almost 2 years working at a large commercial scale feedlot in southern Alberta, where we fed 3-NOP to cattle, fed various diets. So we had backgrounding diets and different kinds of finishing diets. And over the course of the almost 2-year study, we evaluated 15,000 animals. And we measured performance of those animals, feed intake, feed conversion efficiency, weight gain, carcass quality. And we also measured methane productions on a subset of animals. And what we found was, in terms of methane, we had reductions in methane that were very much dependent on the diet and the dose, but those emissions ranged from anywhere between about 20-25% all the way up to 80%. So very much what we saw in our research studies. So depending on the diet and the dose and all that background information, we can pretty much predict methane emission from animals fed 3-NOP. And in terms of performance, we found that in some cases, there was no improvement in performance. In other cases, in some of our high concentrate diets, we saw an improvement in feed conversion efficiency. And there was no negative impacts on, or no major negative impacts on performance or carcass and no impacts on health of the animals. So very positive outcome from that large scale study. And I just mentioned that 3-NOP is still an investigative compound, so it's not something that's commercially available yet in Canada. And I understand in Europe, the company is now undergoing regulatory approval for that compound. And I believe they expect to get approval for that compound in the very near future. So it's something very exciting that's coming through the pipeline that would be available for beef producers who are able to supplement cattle. So this 3-NOP needs to be added to a diet. Now, I know you're probably saying, well, yeah, but what about pasture? That's obviously a very important point. So at this point, the 3-NOP has really been tested in diets. So when added to diets, and I believe the next step then is to tackle that question of, is there a way of supplementing 3-NOP to cattle at pasture? So that is sort of the next step of the research.
Well, as you say, it's early days, but it looks promising.
Very, very promising. There are a couple other feed additives that claim reductions in methane. So for example, there's some really interesting work coming mainly from Australia, but now from the US and other countries, that shows that a particular type of seaweed, that's Asparagopsis texiformis, that's the seaweed, it's a red tropical seaweed, that when added to cattle diets, reduces methane emissions by over 90%. There's not a lot of research yet on that product, but the very preliminary work would show there possibly seems to be an improvement in animal performance as well from that product. But it's still early days, and we certainly need more studies to show that. At a lesser scale, there's feed additives that are microbiology based, so they contain bacteria, and also essential oils based products that when fed to cattle have some evidence to show they reduce methane emissions by up to maybe 10-15%. So that's really product based information. So I think we're going to see a lot of methane reducing products come onto the market in the next couple of years, which is actually a very exciting development for the beef industry.
All cattle belch. I'm sure some breeds belch more than others. Can you selectively breed for less methane production?
There's certainly variation amongst animals in terms of the amount of methane they release, but I'm not aware of differences particularly among breeds. It's within any breed, there is variability among animals. And so there is a lot of interest in measuring methane emissions amongst animals and developing a breeding program for low methane animals. So for example, in New Zealand, which is really at the forefront of that work because they're really focusing their work on sheep, which are animals that are slightly easier to measure methane emissions. They actually have a breeding program now at the producer evaluation stage where they have selected sheep based on low methane production, and they're incorporating that into their breeding objectives. There are other groups around the world that are developing similar programs for dairy animals. With beef animals, it's slightly more difficult just because of the difficulty of measuring methane emissions from beef cattle. But certainly there's a lot of interest in developing low methane breeding objectives. Now, in terms of genetics, I should also mention that for beef cattle in particular, there's interest in reducing emissions by improving feed conversion efficiency. So as I mentioned, the amount of methane an animal produces is primarily related to the amount of feed and the quality of that feed, but the amount of feed that the animal consumes. So animals that are more efficient at converting feed to energy and producing meat are going to have a lower emission. So if we can select animals that are more feed efficient, then those animals also have reduced inputs, they require less feed, and they produce less methane. So there's a lot of benefits in selecting animals that are more feed efficient. And I would say that most animal breeders or most animal breeding programs are taking that objective over selecting low methane animals.
I'm just wondering if, how this actually reflects in terms of traditional breeds, the older breeds, because I'm thinking in terms of like Highland cattle, which, are tremendously good at converting really rough grazing into very, very good meat, but they take longer to do it, and they don't, just pound per pound, they don't produce as much meat, as perhaps a continental breed would.
That is a very good point. When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we really need to talk about greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of beef produced. So if an animal takes 15 months to finish to get to the slaughter plant compared to 30 months, really that the difference on the daily emission is not so important. What's important is the number of days. So an animal that takes 30 months to finish is breathing and eating and emitting methane for 30 months compared to 15, 18 months. And so overall, the emissions per kilogram of beef produced are going to be much greater than for a shorter to finish animal. So it's not just how much methane is produced per day, it's methane production per day times the number of days to market. And that's an important factor in the calculation.
Do you draw any distinction between the greenhouse gases that are produced by livestock and the greenhouse gases that are produced by, say, cars?
That is a very good point. With cars, we're talking about fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are extracted from the earth. They're used in vehicles and transportation. We have CO2 emissions that are emitted into the atmosphere where they are in the atmosphere for a long period of time. With methane from animals, it's part of a biological cycle. So we have energy trapped in plants from photosynthesis. Those plants are converted by the animals to energy that goes into producing meat and milk for human consumption. We have methane being emitted from the system. So it's part of a cycle. That methane is short-lived in the atmosphere. The life cycle of methane is about 12 years in the atmosphere. So that methane is broken down. As well, the animals are maintained on pastures, and those pastures are sequestering carbon, or they are pastures that have sequestered carbon. So there's large carbon reserves that are in those pastures. So the methane from cattle is part of a cycle, whereas the greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel use are not part of a cycle. It's just a one way into the atmosphere. So we have to be very careful when comparing animal production to the use of fossil fuels.
Scots farmers, I think it's fair to say that they're canny. They keep a close eye on the balance sheet. Economics matter to them. I can't imagine that Canadian farmers are any different, particularly so many of them probably came from Scotland originally. But in what way, or is your research benefiting farmers economically in Canada?
That's a very good question. And I get that question a lot from our beef industry because of economics are, of course, the number one important factor for beef production because the margins are often very slim. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from beef cattle production, it's actually hand in hand with improving economic sustainability of the industry. They are not mutually exclusive objectives. So the number one way of reducing greenhouse gases from beef cattle production is improving efficiency of beef cattle production. So it means looking at the system and finding out where those inefficiencies are in the system. For example, it might be reproductive performance, or it might be pasture management. So by tightening up where those inefficiencies occur, producers actually can make more money while they reduce emissions per unit of beef produced. So those goals of economics and sustainability, environmental sustainability, are actually hand in hand and complementary.
And this question might be completely insane, I don't know. Should we think of the belching, the methane lost, as, the methane expelled rather, as energy lost?
When you look at the energy balance, you look at the feed consumed by the animal and the way that feed is digested and utilized by the animal, methane represents for a beef animal approximately 6 to 8% of all the feed consumed, the energy in the feed consumed. 6 to 8% of that energy is lost in the form of methane. So when we first started this research, one of the things I was interested in was, if we reduce the methane emission, which is a loss of energy for the animal, does that mean there might be more energy that could then be put in by the animal into producing meat? So can we capture that energy and get more meat out of the system? We have done studies to look at that, and it's not quite so simple. There are cases where that does occur, but it would depend on how that methane is decreased and whether that energy can then be put into the form of energy substrates that can be used for meat production. But when we reduce methane emissions, for example, using feed additives, and we see large reductions in emissions over 50%, there are some studies that indicate that the animal then becomes more feed efficient. So it reduces its amount of feed used per kilogram of beef produced. But that's not necessarily the case with all methane mitigation strategies.
In Canada, where's the pressure coming from to reduce emissions?
I think there's several factors here. So for consumers, for example, the Canadian government implemented a price on carbon several years ago. So for consumers, we pay a tax, a consumer carbon tax. It started in 2019. It started at $20 per ton, and it rises every year until 2030. It will be $170 a ton. So consumers now are very aware of carbon emissions. They're very interested in ways in reducing carbon emissions. Agriculture is exempt from that tax, so it's a consumer tax. However, industries, both in Canada and internationally, wholesalers and retailers have set carbon emission goals. So a lot of companies are saying they want to be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2050. And a lot of those wholesalers and retailers deal with beef products. And so they want to have beef that helps them respond to their goal of reducing emissions. So they want to source low carbon beef. So that's putting pressure on our beef industry as well.
Are you seeing in Canada people marketing beef saying, look, this is low carbon? You know, we're reducing emissions on this. Well, I suspect what I'm asking is there any sort of PR exercise to tell the general public what it is you are doing?
Well, I'm not aware of any low carbon beef per se, but certainly the Canadian beef industry has been very proactive on this front. And they developed the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative. So it is beef producers, it is wholesalers, retailers, feed manufacturers, et cetera, that have come together around a table with the goal of advancing beef sustainability. And so producing low carbon beef is part of their goal. So the Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef developed a framework, and it's called the Certified Sustainable Beef Framework. So this framework is actually a framework that allows producers to meet certain sustainability goals. So one of them is greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also to do with land use, biodiversity, water, and other elements. So producers can produce beef and market beef that has this retail certification that it's produced under the Certified Sustainable Beef Framework. And then the retailers then can source this beef, and they are comfortable that that beef is produced in a sustainable manner. And so there are companies that are selling, such as McDonald's, they are selling beef in their restaurants that is Canadian sourced, and it's sourced under this Certified Sustainable Beef Framework.
So effectively, it's something that can be badged on a supermarket shelf and people can pick it up and think, right, I know what I'm getting here.
That's right. But it's more than just greenhouse gases, because we know that sustainability of beef production, greenhouse gases is important, but it's also about land use, proper land use and maintaining biodiversity on that land and managing water properly and caring for animals in a sustainable manner and having people work on the farm in a healthy, safety environment and producing high quality. So it's about the entire package.
Coming back to your research, when it comes to, I don't know whether you've got any sense of this, when it comes to reducing emissions from cattle, how low do you think you can go?
So at the research level, we have been evaluating feed additives and diets, for example, and technologies to reduce methane formation in the rumen. And we have seen in some of our studies 80% reduction in methane. There are other groups around the world that have reported over 90% reduction in methane from beef cattle. In this case, they were feeding a particular type of red algae or seaweed. So it is possible to reduce methane formation in the rumen by over 50%. Our goal has been 50%. So there are a number of technologies that are not yet on the market, but they're coming onto the market that would offer beef producers a substantial way of producing low methane beef.
Cattle have been eating grass for a long, long time, millennia. If we are messing about with this, is there any possibility at all that this could negatively impact on their health?
So that's a good question. At first, when we started this work, there was a lot of information from older literature that said that you can't reduce methane emission significantly from a ruminant animal because that methane is a way of that animal keeping the rumen healthy and able to digest fiber. So we were very skeptical that we could reduce methane and have a healthy animal that was productive. But there's a number of research studies now shown that you can reduce methane in an animal by over 50%, and that rumen is completely functioning at a high level, converting feed at a high level. So it gets a little complicated when you talk about the biochemistry of the rumen. So long as we don't impair the functionality of the bacteria that are involved in degrading the fiber, we can reduce methane emissions. So that methane, the hydrogen that is generated, hydrogen and CO2 are removed from the rumen by forming methane. So long as that hydrogen has somewhere else to go in the rumen, another hydrogen sink, you can continue to reduce methane emissions and have a healthy ruminant animal.
How many years have you been working as a scientist in this field? It's an ungentlemanly question, I'm sorry, but...
So I'm very near retirement. I've been working in this field of animal nutrition for over 35 years, but it's only been in the past 20 years that I started my interest in methane emissions. And it's interesting, when I first started in the late 1990s measuring methane emissions along with my colleagues, and I talked to the beef industry about that, I couldn't get them very interested in the whole concept of reducing methane emissions. I mean, they would just look at me and their eyes would sort of glaze over. What the heck is she up to, right? But now fast forward 20 years later, 25 years later, environmental issues are really at the forefront. And I think beef producers have started to understand that improving production efficiency and environmental goals often go hand in hand. So they don't have to be afraid of embracing the concept of environmental sustainability. And I think the beef industry now understands that it's a win-win. Improving production efficiency, enhancing environmental impacts go together, and they're not mutually exclusive. And they will ultimately help beef industry into the future.
Karen, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you very much, Mark. It's really been a pleasure. And hello to all the beef producers in Scotland that are interested in this podcast. Thanks very much.
No, thank you. If you haven't heard it, please also have a listen to the QMS podcast we did with dietitian Diana Rogers, author of Sacred Cow, because interestingly, there's quite a lot of overlap. I think you'll find it interesting. I'm Mark Stephen. Speaking generally of the podcast, I hope you found it useful.
Thank you for listening to the Quality Meat Scotland podcast. For news and to listen back to previous episodes of the podcast, visit qmscotland.com. scotchkitchen.co.uk. For Scotch beef, Scotch lamb and specially selected pork recipe videos and inspiration, visit www.scotchkitchen.com or follow Scotch Kitchen on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter.